Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Teena Jha, you're watching Perspective. So in our ongoing series on the themes of the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration, today we will discuss international taxation. At the 18th G20 Summit, the global leaders reaffirmed their commitment to continue cooperation towards a globally fair, sustainable and modern international tax system appropriate to the needs of the 21st century. They expressed commitment to the swift implementation of the two-pillar international tax package, recognizing the need for coordinated efforts towards capacity building to implement the two-pillar international tax package effectively. Besides, the G20 also called for the swift implementation of the crypto asset reporting framework. So we'll talk about all the significant aspects mentioned in the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration with eminent experts joining us on the program. I'm pleased to welcome in the studio Mr. Priyadarshi Dash, Associate Professor, RIS, Co-Chair, T20 Task Force on Reassessing the Global Financial Order G20, and Managing Editor, G20 Digest. It's a journal. Thank you, sir, for your time and welcome to Sansad TV. And joining us virtually is another guest, Ms. Suranjali Tandon. She's Associate Professor, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. Ms. Tandon, glad to have you with us on the show. Welcome to Sansad TV. Mr. Dash, let me begin the program today with you. First, to understand, what have been some of the flagship priorities under India's G20 presidency, which has been actively pursued for international taxation?
I think I would say there are a couple of areas where Indian presidency has made significant contribution. For example, there are legacy issues of how the large companies or multinational enterprises to be taxed. So that has been there since past several presidencies. So India has made a step forward in making progress in sort of agreeing to the framework. How to implement pillar 1 and pillar 2. And as you mentioned, crypto assets are the emerging challenges for the financial system. So how crypto assets and crypto asset related transactions could complicate the tax system. So India has sort of taken that debate to the next stage and implementing that framework in a coordinated fashion among the G20 countries. Of course, the 130 countries, those who are member of the inclusive framework. Third most important thing is the capacity building aspects of the developing countries cooperation in the international tax framework, and the automatic exchange of information that we had before, and then focus on that. So all together, if you see that Indian presidency has sort of advanced the understanding on international tax architecture, and I believe that the next presidencies will build on that and try to make the international tax system more adaptive, more say accommodative towards the developing countries' needs. Right. In terms of resource mobilization.
Okay. So we'll try and understand each of these priorities one by one. To begin with, Ms. Tandon, if I may ask you to explain to us and our viewers what the two-pillar international tax package is, because the G20 leaders reaffirmed their commitment to the swift implementation of this package.
Thank you. I think it would take another show to explain these pillars much in detail, but for the use of your listeners, I think it's important to say simply what this means. One that Mr. Dash has already talked about. We are all familiar with Google, Amazon, and such big companies which exist across the world, operate across the world. But what we have seen from news reports is that they don't pay enough taxes, and this is where the agenda started. There was a need for reforming the international tax system to say, well, this company is located in a country like India, it's doing business, it's making profits, and so therefore it should pay its tax here. And in order to do that, the agenda was built in two ways. One is that there will be new allocation of or rules of allocation of taxes across the world. So it is not as if the countries where these are residents of is where there'll be right to collect taxes. Countries like India will have a greater share of these taxes, is what the aim of Pillar 1 was. And it's not about just allocation of taxes. There's also been enough talk about locating all kinds of intellectual property in countries where there was low tax, so that all the rents from this would go there and only basic taxes would be collected in countries such as India. And so Pillar 2 says that large MNEs, which have a threshold of annual revenue of more than 750 million euros across the world, should be paying an effective tax rate of 15% in every jurisdiction. So in a way, it says that we are going to top up on the taxes that are not collected, which are below 15%.
Okay, okay, Mr. Dash. So, how path-breaking is this solution in terms of, emphasizing the global collaboration for effective tax reforms? Also, what kind of ramifications will they have for developing economies? India has made the G20 more inclusive. Now, the African Union is part of the G20. So, if we can understand the ramifications for new and emerging economies.
I think I would begin with this point. Why so much emphasis on taxation reforms, domestically and internationally? We are having a financing gap, SDG financing gap to the tune of 4 trillion plus. And during COVID, the resource constraints the developing countries faced, including the advanced economies. So we need to step up the resource mobilization efforts. And taxation is a major source of revenue for the developing countries. So the international taxation reforms that we have been talking about for quite some time, a framework by UN, a framework by OECD. So Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, as Suranjali just mentioned, this debate was there and sort of settling down in terms of what needs to be done. And perhaps the agreement would facilitate effective implementation of Pillar 2, which will lead to $150 billion of additional revenue for the developing countries. And the reallocation aspects of under Pillar 1, reallocation of the profits once the Pillar 1 is implemented would generate 125 billion of additional revenue. So altogether, $275 billion resources would be released if this Pillar 2 solution is adopted and implemented effectively. Now, what about the Indian presidency's contribution? It sort of made it consolidated, that everybody agreed that yes, we now move on. And besides that, the crypto asset is a future asset categories which are complex to understand, and how the current tax machinery would try to cope with the challenges that would come through the digital platforms. So maybe a few more billion of additional resources could be generated by taxing the crypto related assets of the MNEs. But the capacity building aspects also needs to be emphasized. You asked the developing country how it would help the developing countries and why it is so important for them. Developing countries would have some sort of tax predictability, that how much they are going to mobilize from the taxable sources. The Pillar 2 implementation, there was a fear that developing countries may lose their, say, room maneuvering space to tax, but that is protected through the treaty based subject to STTR, subject to tax rules. So that would protect their taxing ability, like certain payments, certain interest, royalties like that. So it won't dilute their tax base, it will protect their tax base and prepare them to face the new tax environment which Pillar 2
Okay,
is
I'll come back and understand more on the crypto asset regulatory framework, because that is one area of concern that India highlighted at the G20. But coming back to you, Ms. Tandon, on the aspect of developing economies and how the steps initiated by India are going to help the developing economies, particularly so because for the developing world, tax evasion has been a major problem when we talk about international taxation. So the existing international financial architecture enables flight of capital from the developing world to these tax havens, Switzerland, London, New York. The question here is, when we adopt these new strategies that the G20 outlines, will it help these developing countries retain that money within themselves? Because currently what's happening is they end up losing more money than they receive from investments.
That's a good question. I think that's been the effort, at least for the past few years. I mean, I also mentioned that India has been absolutely instrumental in the negotiations of what you're seeing now as Pillar 1, Pillar 2. But moving beyond that, I think the question that you're asking about is on tax evasion. And the OECD has taken initiative along with other multilateral organizations to set up infrastructures such as tax inspectors without borders, which is an initiative to help countries tackle some of these areas for tax evasion. African countries have made some headway there. In terms of reporting frameworks, as was mentioned earlier, so there's something called the automatic exchange of information. This is an agreement between countries to share information about their taxpayers, about assets. And I think that's quite handy for a tax department trying to figure out who's locating their money in a separate jurisdiction under what entity. So I think over the last 10 years or so of the base erosion and profit shifting program, which initiated this reform, we've seen quite a bit of headway being made there. I think one gap that remained and is being spoken of under the OECD now is of the real estate assets on which there has been no mapping. And we know that a lot of tax evasion tends to move to real estate-based assets. And the second one, of course, is crypto, which is the new and emerging assets. So the frameworks that are being proposed under the declaration, as well as the work supported by the OECD, talks about these measures to plug in the loopholes that you're talking about.
Okay. So, coming back on the crypto asset regulatory framework, now, of course, the effort is to ensure that newly emerging risks to global tax transparency are effectively countered. And for that, the crypto asset reporting framework has been proposed. There need to be amendments to the common reporting standards. Help us and our viewers understand what this framework is going to do, because this market is particularly unregulated. There's been one big step at the G20 summit this year. But from the aspect of global tax transparency, is it going to be an important step?
Yes, it is going to be an important step. As I mentioned, what happens, why we are focusing so much on tax transparency? Because if there is any room for the corporate sector, the big enterprises to say understand the space to avoid tax, they engage in aggressive tax competition or tax planning, lowering of tax rates. So when the crypto assets are gaining attraction in the financial market, and the technological platform which cryptography, distributed ledger technology backed by blockchain. So these type of asset category and the risks involved with such kind of transactions are not properly understood. If you see the other part of the declaration on crypto itself, it is mentioned that the macroeconomic implications of the crypto assets and the central bank digital currency will be understood by the G20 countries, and they need some time to properly assess the regulatory challenges out of that. So given that state of understanding on crypto assets, what type of additional reporting requirement needed under the CRS, common reporting system, so that the countries understand in different jurisdictions what type of activity happen, what are those assets which are taxable, whether there is any lapse in the current framework which does not recognize certain transactions happen through the crypto platforms which are outside the ambit of taxation. So what are the assets to be taxed, and whether the regulations are enough to sort of cater to the crypto framework or not. So these are the new sort of regulatory requirement are coming, and the CARF, crypto asset reporting system, will take care of that. If you go into the specific rules, perhaps that will be a complex set of rules, and we already have global base for anti-erosion. So it in tandem with that rule, this will be sort of facilitate exchange of information from 2027 onwards. So I think this, in simpler terms, one understands the reporting system for crypto like this.
Okay, okay. My next question to you, Ms. Tandon, is now on the compliance. So the fact that, G20 leaders have tried to address international taxation at every summit starting 2008, but more or less all of the challenges that we've spoken about exist even today. It's good that significant new steps are being taken in the area of international taxation, which are appropriate to the 21st century needs. But if we look at the outcome documents and their correlation with compliance, it's quite weak. How do we ensure, and in fact, if I could put it this way, what needs to be done to increase compliance with the commitments that are made by G20 leaders during the summit?
That's a very astute point, I would say, because usually the international tax section is broad and it conveys that there is consensus, but these are just principles which have not been put into place for a long time. And just to point out that this is not a final solution. There are countries that are still pushing for more. One of the problems with Pillar 1, Pillar 2, for example, is that while it promises the additionality of revenue, it's not quite enough for some countries to implement because it's quite costly. There's also been a talk of digital services tax being implemented by different countries. And of course, the US has to be on board, and 2/3 majority of the Senate has to agree to this. So I think what needs to be done in the year ahead is to figure out what are the nuts and bolts of this program, where there are disagreements. I think they need to be closed. There are a few, including, I won't go into the detail of it. There is something called the subject to tax rule, which was considered by G24 as more important than what G7 think in terms of the overall structure of the minimum tax. So all of those have to be agreed on, and I think they're drawing to a close, the process. So perhaps maybe next year's declaration will have some finality on what the plan looks like.
Okay, Mr. Dash, your thoughts on this weak correlation that we're talking about between the outcome documents that come out at G20 vis-a-vis their compliance. There are several reasons, but has digitalization also added to these challenges?
Yeah, of course. Digitalization has to be seen from both positive and the negative angles. The positive aspects is that how the digitalization related changes in the way transactions happen overall in the financial sector, if we are talking about taxation for that matter. It has to be understood in a sense that the taxation terminologies like substance, the nexus rules, all these will not fit in a brick and mortar format. So digitalization, implementing digitalization in a massive way is not just the responsibility of the G20. What G20 has done in the past presidencies and during Indian presidency in particular, emphasizing on digital public infrastructure for that matter. We have seen UPI transactions growing dramatically in a short span of time. So all this together, digitalization, rise in trading of crypto assets, increasing adoption of central bank digital currencies. So all this together create a new set of asset categories, new operating environment, which needs the overhauling of the financial system, and of which the taxation system, of course, is the most complex and the most challenging one. Compliance to G20 commitments, be it digitalization, be it SDG, be it taxation, would depend on how the member countries themselves observe that commitment and implement as part of their national economic policy. Because G20 is a consensus making organization. None of the commitments of G20 is binding on any member state. So you take that as a basis, as a benchmark for implementing as part of a national policy and advocating for a larger adoption worldwide. So the same would be applicable for taxation. As I mentioned in the beginning, that for more than a decade, as Suranjali was mentioning, base erosion and profit shifting. Now we have moved ahead, and Indian presidency says swift implementation of that. So implementation is the real challenge. So swift implementation means every jurisdiction takes in letter and spirit and follows the guidelines in a manner so that there is no gap in terms of reporting. So we have to see in that sense.
So, you know, when you say implementation is the challenge, India achieved huge success in, you know, getting consensus on every word of the declaration from each of the members.
Yeah.
The question now is, and the fact that our declaration was quite forward-looking, quite action-oriented, how do we translate it into action is the next question.
See, again, it is just a very tough question. I think Indian presidency will leave some impact in the G20 deliberations in the coming years because it was a developing country presidency. As you know, from Indonesia onwards, 4 consecutive developing country presidencies would definitely try to push the development agenda in a very strong way, which we have done. With 83 paragraphs and 112 outcomes, none of these summit declarations in the past was so substantive. And all the world leaders have unanimously adopted this. So what I believe that in fact the entire intelligentsia is taking this as a reference document, that how do we see inclusive and sustainable development would happen and we meet the SDG goals in the future. This become a reference document for the for few years from now. What needs to be done is that we don't give up just with the declaration. We need to do some follow-up activity, like Prime Minister has assured the G20 countries that perhaps a virtual session in November could take stock of that where we are.
Okay.
Now in 2 months' time we may not do much, but at least in principle, how the world has observed this declaration and the recommendations of the Indian presidency.
What's commendable is, Ms. Tandon, the Indian presidency has played a pivotal role in galvanizing that inclusive framework. At least we've taken the first big step. The question is, how do you see it fructify into solid action and swift implementation? That's the key word here.
Yeah, so in fact, I should say that, you know, what we're seeing at the G20 is really the culmination of all the hard work that India's put in over years, at least the last 4 years, on designing and influencing the, you know, the pillar 1, pillar 2. I think the declaration really puts its stamp on it and says that, well, we can move forward on this if we were to sort of agree on some of the last remaining points. In terms of, you know, the positive side of this is that the conversations on the two-pillar package is continuing. It's still alive, and it is going to be monitored over the next few months. And I think what we'll see there is India will continue to push ahead for much of the reform, which is also being pushed at the African Forum for Taxation. So it's been an interesting cooperation between India and other developing countries that have pushed for reform under this package. And I think they will try and iron out some of the remaining differences. And you know, what we are seeing already is the EU, for example, is going ahead to implement or proposing to implement the pillar 2 first, which is the minimum tax, and that might actually become a reality. So, so in a sense, the declaration has set the tone for what we're going to see in the next few months.
Okay, with that hope, we'll have to wind up the program. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on this edition of Perspective, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well. I'll see you same time tomorrow now. Take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.